in my research, I was supposed to, in fact, to collaborate with the concrete material evidence which I could supply. It is my luck that actually I was able to supply most of them. And also, it was also important for me at that time because I was actually a kind of researcher who was vagrant in many ways, showed tendencies which are not becoming of a historical researcher at that time. But she tolerated much of my activism, including my political activism at that time. But at the same time, she was continuously reminding me that my primary activity, my primary responsibility was historical research, which I should, in fact, assiduously hold on to. But unfortunately for me, I did not really, in fact, hold on to, or even, in fact, satisfy her expectations as a researcher, and which she was not forthcoming. In fact, she was very clear about this fact, and in fact scolded me on my own kind of vagrancy as well as a recalcitrancy, which I showed in my later years. But I remember, as Professor Keshavan in one of his comments in the Facebook mentioned, which I think he is mentioning it again, she was like a mother to all of us. And this motherliness, this care, this affection, which she showed even to a normal student under her, was in fact invigorating, as well as, which was something that in fact made us continue with our research activities, never lose heart. Whenever there was an adversity which was in fact coming on to us several times. And this is something which I remember all the time, whenever I remember her as a teacher as well as a person, as a student as well as a person. So this is something which I remember her. I don't want to continue much more here. I'm sure that many of us will remember her much more detail, and fond memories will be given here by several of the teachers, presenters here. And I stop here and invite Professor Romila Thapar to present her memories to us.
Shall I say what I have to say?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
It is extremely difficult for me to speak about Professor Champakalakshmi after her very recent passing away. For me, she was that rare combination of being both a close friend and a much admired colleague at work, and whom I greatly cherished. Such friendships are rare. When they happen, they have to be appreciated with all the respect, admiration, and affection that one can muster. I first met Professor Champakalakshmi in the mid-60s of the last century. I was visiting Chennai to deliver a lecture at the University of Madras. After I had given the lecture, which was on historiography in the study of ancient India, Champaka, as we all came to call her in subsequent times, introduced herself and asked if I would answer a question that troubled her. Her question was as to what was the significance of the Mauryan emperor Ashoka using different languages for his edicts and within Prakrit variant regional forms. I recognized in an instant that she did not conform to being what was the usual teacher at university level, but was a scholar familiar with the sources which she was studying from different perspectives. I met her for lunch the next day so that we could, at leisure, discuss her questions on my lecture. The lunch was a delight. Champak sparkled in her scholarship, which at that time was bound up in the history of South India and in artifacts such as sculpture in particular, as well as whatever could be garnered from temple architecture of the same area. Much of the detail was new to me, so it was a pleasure to be discussing it with a knowledgeable person. What was so impressive was that not only was she familiar with the places, but also with the artifacts. Inevitably, we discussed why the two, the object and the location, were linked. I gradually imbibed knowledge about the South Indian past. Visiting historical sites with her, as we did on many occasions, was an unforgettable experience. She knew equally well the nuances of both the textual sources through her study of Tamil and Sanskrit, as well as art historical data. Her interpretations of what she saw were based on deep knowledge. I learned much from her, and she opened up many new perspectives on South Indian history, which we both enjoyed exploring. From our first conversations, we, as they say, hit it off and never stopped exchanging possible ideas. She was warm and friendly when expressing her views and firm in holding to them. She was not carping or being sarcastic about the opinions of others, and we soon became close friends. A couple of other institutions, such as the Madras Christian College in Tambaram, asked me to give lectures, and this took me to Chennai. It soon became routine that I would go one day earlier, which day was kept for spending with Champak. This routine continued with every visit to Chennai when she was still in Chennai. I simply would not give up on Champaka's company and her hospitality. It was the same indulgence when I visited her home, where her sister, the numismatist Vanaja, then working in the National Museum, was also resident. So when we started the Center for Historical Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University, we decided that South Indian history from the earliest beginnings must have full space, much more than is generally given in most universities. So who would we find to take charge of this? It was Champaka, who was declared as the obvious and outstanding choice for a specialist in South Indian history, in order to build a specialization in that history at our center. Her contribution to the intellectual formation of the center as a whole was equally enormous and was to benefit all of us faculty, and students. The most remarkable aspect of her coming to JNU was for us to witness both the expansion and the diversity of her intellectual interest in aspects of South Indian history, and how effectively she located South Indian history in the wider context of the history of the subcontinent. This was new and challenging to many historians who tended to study South Indian history as a kind of separate entity, ranging from archaeological sources to how data moves into periods with written sources. These used to be treated as two distinct bodies of evidence, with little attention given to links in the two sources, in terms of the artifacts that were also described in written sources. But this began to change with the work of people like Champaka and her students. A small example of this combination, as it were, of archaeological and textual evidence are the sherds of amphorae carrying wine as part of the Indo-Roman trade. And then the appreciation in Shangam texts of the wine brought by the Yavanas. The study of South Indian history had earlier focused on dynasties and the activities of rulers, or on the building of temples regarded as the most important structures. But now there was an added dimension, the study of institutions of governance, of social relations, and of economic concerns. This is closer to what constitutes the history of people and their daily lives. Temples began to be viewed as institutions of religious intent and supporting the economy of the kingdom and social practices. Had there not been wealthy donors, then wealthy temples could not have been built. Therefore, temples needed to be seen both as superb examples of local architecture and of art historical forms in their sculptures. But it should not be forgotten that the temples also had facets that controlled the social activity of the people who worshipped there. Champak and those that carried out the research that she highlighted not only pointed out the evolution of these institutions, but also that it gave rise to the form of new religious sects and social and economic organizations. Why, for example, did resources originally controlled by individual members of society get organized into a system of control by guilds, some of those of the peninsula being the most powerful in the medieval period of the subcontinent? Such changes also affected notions of the state and governance, as reflected in Champak's analysis of the Chola state. Her critique of Bertenstein's treatment of South India as a medieval society was deeply impressive and reflected the new ideas now entering the histories of South India. Links with different histories in various parts of India were recognized. Inevitably, the emphasis on regional studies that this required gave us a far better analysis of the patterns of medieval states than what had been known before. These analyses brought the history of the peninsula into the context of medieval India in a broader sense, a context that was beginning to hesitantly develop with the discovery of connections between the regions or with the comparative study of differences. The region came into its own, as did the environment and sub-regions. Trade was a major factor in building and establishing the economic connections, which, in a sense, were symbolic of other connections. One of these were migrations from north to south in the subcontinent, and also from areas across the seas when Indian traders hosted settlements of traders from West Asia, as indeed they had been doing for a millennium before, resulting in a variety of cultural admixtures. Champaka and her students were providing a new dimension to these studies. Indian traders going east to Southeast Asia had a strong backing, not only from South Indian traders, but also from the guilds, as indeed the ruling dynasties. This trade was one of the factors that helped keeping them politically in power. Champaka was outspoken in her views on subjects and in general. The opinions she expressed were cogent and firm, backed by strong arguments. But she wasn't rigid. If she could be convinced otherwise by rational arguments, she would allow herself some change of view. The firmness was eminently sensible. She was immensely popular among students, and this was because she was always ready to clarify her historical explanations and make sure that they were correctly understood. Post-tutorial explanations, after the tutorial had been held, consisted of sessions of coffee at her house. Sometimes, especially for her colleagues, it was not just coffee, but a delicious meal as well. As we both grew older and after we retired, we would often reminisce about the past and remember all the many occasions when we enjoyed what we were doing. I would like to remember her in such moments when she not only clarified the knots of history, but was also an exceptional person. Thank you.
Present his views.
Respected Professor Thapar, my dear colleagues and students. I never thought that I would be called upon at some point of time to speak about Professor Champakalakshmi. As Professor K.N. Ganesh said, and Professor Keshavan stated, she has always been motherly. I remember whenever I met her at her residence, I would be having a rough version of one of the chapters of my MPhil dissertation. But the first thing that she would inquire was, Rajan, what will you have? And then I was free to say, I do not require anything now. I have already taken this or that. Then immediately she would retort, that is the reason you look like this. You are not eating properly. That used to be her complaints. And I remember that other than from the hands of my own mother, I have been served food from Mrs. M.G.S. Narayan and Professor Champakalakshmi. And I fail to make a distinction in terms of taste of the food served by these three mothers. Now, Champakalakshmi had an altogether different mood when we sat in chairs face to face. A very tough supervisor. She used to complain, Rajan, you are going on your own. Have you ever noticed the distance between what you say and what is already there in the source material? You are taking to the source material far more than you get out of it. And once she said, what is the license that you have to take all kinds of things to the source material? Where is this? Show me. But, you know, I was straining at the least to adopt a new technique of using source material. And in my own way, I have been trying to make myself familiar with theoretical studies. And all the theories I used to look at as very powerful historical generalizations made by people wiser and more learned than myself. And my feeling was that I should be able to make that kind of generalization. And that kind of generalization would always require a craft to escape from the linguistic trap of the source material. You should be able to use the source material not to explain what is already there, but to imagine how it worked rather than what it meant. It would be extremely difficult to speak in the light of source material what exactly happened. That's my experience, maybe due to my poor craft of historical imagination. It's very, very difficult to speak about what really happened. You would be able to imagine how things worked. It is possible only by using theoretical frameworks or using some strong frameworks of comprehension. This I tried to learn from the works of Professor Romila Thapar and from discussions with her. I don't claim to have learned everything or understood everything that she tried to put across, but in chairs face to face with her, I had an altogether different experience. She, I think, used to tell me there's no point in describing the content of your source material as it is. But she also rather, taught me to be really be close to the source material, source first. That was her message as well. When she said source first and be empirical, I understood that she never meant that your task is not to give a description of the source material, but to discover what is underlying and significant in that. And it is the way you look at it. What you find underlying and significant in the source material need not necessarily be what others would find and claim as their discovery. And then, see, it is with whatever theoretical understanding you have, you try to understand what is underlying and significant. Once you are clear that linguistically what the source material denotes is not that easy to be grasped, then you have the freedom to go ahead with the motor of theory to talk about what it connotes, what the source material with which you have a relationship of cognitive encounter. What that source material connotes is your concern, not what it denotes. You do not know the way language worked at that time. You do not know the meaning of the expressions, terms, the metaphors. You do not have a very clear idea. Maybe it is because of my inefficiency in understanding the language in the historical context. I admit. I used to understand various inscriptions with the help of Dr. Keshavan, Dr. Raghava Warrior, and so on. That inefficiency is there, and this is the best way to escape from my inefficiency, to claim that you understand source material when you are theoretically knowledgeable. And the evidence that you are talking about is not out there for anybody to go and pick. This evidence is constructed in the light of the source material, and it is not there. It is not there in the source material, but you will be able to construct this evidence once you know the theory. That means the evidence is that which is signified by your understanding of the society of the past in theoretical terms. Now, the wonder that happened was, as Professor Ganesh said, she gave me freedom to do that. Although she quarreled every time and tried to educate me, maybe because she finally understood that this incorrigible fellow would remain like that. But she was so helpful and was kind enough to leave everything to me by making me wary of the consequences. That she invariably said, Rajan, if you want to retain this, I have no objection. But, and also I will try to find out the examiners, the evaluators, who would be equally erratic and maverick, so that they would be kind enough to what you write. Luckily, I got my dissertations passed and with good comments by the examiners, thanks to her selection of such examiners. This is the wonderful experience that on the one side, quarreling with the student and then trying to educate, but never going beyond that to impose something upon the candidate. No researcher ever had the experience of Professor Champakalakshmi pushing her understanding, her ideas into the researcher. And she always tried to make hardcore methodological corrections, but never wanted to take her interpretation to the researcher. And I was lucky to get various interpretations I made were rephrased and made presentable by Professor Champakalakshmi. If I had written as the interpretations occurred to me and presented in the thesis, after 3-4 years, they would have become rubbish to myself. I am certainly feeling now ashamed of the way I tried to put across some of my interpretations. They all became presentable thanks to the kind interventions she made, the way she made the corrections with the patience of a composition checking teacher. Now I feel how deeply indebted I am to Professor Champakalakshmi. There were various occasions where she could have snapped me saying that you haven't read these things. Your understanding is very poor. That would have certainly destroyed me. Instead, that motivated me like anything. She always started her criticism with a good appreciation of what I have done. Now I know, when this was the case with Professor Romila Thapar also. Now I would not be standing, say, at this stage if Professor Thapar and Professor Champak had disclosed the truth straight at my face. Instead, they all appreciated what I try to write. Now I know that they were utterly obsolete. The writing depending upon writings which were already rejected, particularly the professors who had made a total rebuttal of certain things, but without knowing this, I was repeating. This could have been really rejected by saying that what you have written is outdated, totally outdated. Instead of saying that, or instead of saying right at my face, they tolerated my ignorance and encouraged me to read and develop. If I, in some way, matter in my field of specialization, it's all because of the kindness of Professor Champakalakshmi and Professor Thapar. With these words, I stop my reminiscence.
Request Professor Keshav Velathat to say a few words.
Respected Chairman, respected Professor Romila, my esteemed colleagues and fellow students of history. This is one of the saddest moments for me. Professor Champakalakshmi, whom we lost last week, combined in her the best elements of two traditions of scholarship. Trained by the stalwarts of Madras School of Historiography, such as Professor Neelakanta Shastri and T.V. Mahalingam, she was uncompromising in the use of sources, meticulous, transparent, and thoroughgoing. At the same time, remaining alive to the new developments in historical writing in India in the 60s and 70s of the last century. She brought a theoretical understanding to bear on the rich details at her command in historical studies, particularly after she moved to the Jawaharlal Nehru University. This combination of empirical control and theoretical rigor marks her out. Her earlier works on Jainism, with elaborate details collected from inscriptions, texts, and sculpture, submitted to the University of Madras for her MLit degree, and Vaishnava iconography, submitted to PhD, are characterized by the meticulous details in their respective fields. For instance, in the PhD thesis, which was later published, unfortunately, the Jainism thesis is not published as it is, although a few papers she has published. But in the Vaishnava iconography book, we can see the command that she had over the texts, the Agama texts, such as the Pancharatra and Vaikhanasa texts, and also knowledge of the avatars as they are represented in sculpture, the four vyuhas of Vishnu that are worshipped in South India. And added to this, a thorough personal knowledge of nearly every Vaishnava temple that you have in South India. If you just mention a particular temple, she would say, yes, you get down at this railway station, walk in that direction 7 miles, and you reach that temple. No, she was so thorough about every Vaishnava temple in South India. So textual, epigraphical, sculptural, architectural, there was no detail that she was no master of. She gradually started also bringing in theoretical refinements with her studies on urbanization. Her work on Kudamukku Parayare was perhaps the beginning in this direction, a combination of empirical richness and theoretical clarity. In fact, her work on the work which came out later in the form of a book, Trade, Ideology and Urbanization, can be considered as the first major statement in that direction. Similarly, she started working on the processes of state formation and ideology, a paper which she generously contributed to a first shift that I had brought out to Professor B. Shekhali. The sovereignty of the divine can perhaps be looked upon as her first step in this direction. The introduction she wrote to the special issue of Studies in History devoted to state, which she guest edited, is among the finest statements on the subject. So also, State and Society in Pre-Modern South India, which she generously enough agreed to co-edit with T.R. Venugopalan and myself, is another of her less known but more important works with these twin concerns, namely ideology and state formation. She has made an indelible mark in South India's historiography. She did not have to cover a long distance from this to her other works, for example, religion, tradition, and ideology, pre-colonial South India. A remarkable feature of Professor Champakalakshmi is the passion she had for teaching, which I can vouchsafe because I had done 2 courses with her. She also guided me through my MPhil. I shall come back to this later. Among those who are present here, Professors Rajan Gurukal and K.N. Ganesh are also her students, and you have known how intimately they took her and how obliged they feel to her. She had taught, before she had moved to JNU, some of the leading figures of South Indian history today, such as Y. Subbarayulu and P. Shanmukham, while she was in Madras University. The way in which she continued to track her students and their work is remarkable. I am reminded of a moving episode. Professor Y. Subbarayulu was giving the Malcolm S. Adisheshayya lecture in the Madras Institute of Development Studies. After the preliminaries, Professor Champakalakshmi invited Professor Subbarayulu. Professor Champakalakshmi was chairing the session. She invited Professor Subbarayulu to speak with these words. I quote, Professor Subbarayulu was my student in the MA class. After that, he went on to do an MPhil, MLit with Professor Mahalingam and published his thesis, The Political Geography of the Chola country. Ever since, he was my teacher. This is Professor Champakalakshmi, person who is ready to learn from her students and treats her student as a teacher after that student has become a scholar in his own right. If I start talking about the innumerable ways in which Professor Champakalakshmi has kept me under an irredeemable debt, I will be lost. But since this is an occasion to remember her fondly than to assess her contribution as a historian. I crave your indulgence in sharing with you some of the incidents for which I have always felt she is my mother, who did not, of course, bear me. When I joined JNU for my MPhil program in the monsoon semester in 1974, I had not known her. There was some problem about the announcement of the results of the admission test, which went on indefinitely. The Viva Voce examination that was part of my MA was long pending in Calicut. So I couldn't stay in Delhi, I couldn't go to Calicut. That was the confusion in which I was. It may happen any day without adequate notice. I might lose a chance if I went to Calicut without waiting for the results in JNU. I might fail in my MA if I did not go to Calicut. Then I got a telegraphic communication from Calicut saying that on the third day would be my MA Viva. Tickets were not available. Those days there was no computer booking, etc. I went to the railway station and I was told that there was no ticket at all. There were those days there were no direct trains. One had to change at Madras. Tickets were not available. When I was unpacking my woes in front of Professor K.N. Panikar, another teacher of the center, who was of course there on the board that interviewed me, was in the room. She told me that she knew a travel agent who would somehow manage a ticket for me. She took me by her own car, the blue Premier Padmini, you would remember. Those of you who were there at that time in JNU would remember the blue Premier Padmini. She drove it herself, took me to the travel agent, managed a ticket for me, then put me in the train, waited there until the train left. Why should she do it? Yes, a mother should do it. I was guided by Professor Champakalakshmi for my MPhil. I was regularly going to the library of the Archaeological Survey of India, Sapru House, Central Secretariat, all of which were around Connaught Place. So I would take the 7:30 bus from the campus. The JNU used to have a bus those days going to Connaught Place. Some of my class fellows were suspicious of me. Why is this fellow taking the early morning bus to go to Connaught Place? So they went and told Professor Champakalakshmi, this fellow seems not to be very serious. He's having a nice time going to Connaught Place and such centers. And she unfortunately took it seriously. One day when I went to get my fellowship bill signed, I was getting a relatively decent fellowship. When I went there to get my fellowship bill signed, she promptly signed the bill, then asked me in a tone which very clearly indicated that she meant business. She asked me, what were you doing these days? What have you been doing? I said, why? I was working in Archaeological Survey Library. I'm coming from the library, in fact, until about half an hour ago. I was there. Show me your notes. And I took out the cards. Those days, we used to take down notes in the cards. I took out the cards, some 50 of them, kept her on the table. She took one of them. She said, this is in Malayalam. Then I said, yes, I was taking down notes for a term paper I am doing with Professor Thapa. Since these are Sanskrit inscriptions, Malayalam script is as good as Devanagari, but I am more at home with Malayalam than Devanagari. So I took down these notes. Then she said, read it. I started reading from that inscription. The moment I started reading from the inscription, this was an inscription of an obscure ruler whom I had not heard about, a certain Allah Shakti. I said, Allah Shakti. The moment I said Allah Shakti, she said, yes, Sendraka, 7th century. Yes, read on. Then she forgot that she was taking a truant student to task. She started seriously engaging with Allah Shakti, the Sendrakas, their land grants, and the way in which immunities were given in the land grants, and started talking about it. I was amazed by the command that she had over these sources, but my amazement was nothing when I realized that she had forgotten that she was taking me to task. On many other occasions, whenever I was doing a term paper with her, whenever I was drafting my thesis, etc., one thing, as Rajan said, that she insisted was, you must know your sources thoroughly. There is no compromise on that. Ruthless she was in insisting on your knowledge of the sources. I shall now tell you something in front of which everything else would pale into insignificance. After I had completed my coursework for the MPhil, I was promoted directly to PhD without having to submit my dissertation. This is because those days in JNU, I do not know if it is there even now, those days in JNU, there was this provision that if a student gets relatively decent grades in the coursework, he or she can be exempted from submitting the thesis for MPhil, directly promoting him to PhD. I was directly promoted to PhD. Those days, conditions back home were very bad. I was very badly in need of students, both of a job. Both my parents were ill. My sisters were still studying. My younger brother was still in the school. So I had the responsibility of a relatively huge household. So I had to stay home. I was promoted to PhD all right, but I couldn't leave home. So I managed to get a job in Kerala. I joined Kodukallur Kunjikuttanampuram College. And at that time, Professor M.G.S. Narayanan agreed to guide me for PhD. So I had decided that I will continue for PhD in Calicut. I will give up my JNU degree. When Professor Bipan Chandra had visited Calicut on some UGC assignment, I explained these things. He encouraged me, yes, you can do that. There is absolutely nothing wrong about it. But in that case, you complete your MPhil. You just submit your dissertation, get your MPhil degree, because a degree from JNU is going to stand you in good stead. I had forgotten about the MPhil thesis. It was about 2 years after I had left JNU. Professor Champakalakshmi, perhaps she remembered, perhaps she forgot. I did not know. Anyway, with great diffidence, I wrote a letter to Professor Champakalakshmi explaining these things. Professor Champakalakshmi immediately wrote back, not only welcoming the idea, but also telling me that we had finalized the charter scheme for the thesis and telling me details about it. I had my notes and she said I could write the draft. So I drafted it and wrote to her saying that I'm ready with the draft. When should I come to Delhi to get it corrected? She said, you don't have to travel all the way to Delhi. Anyway, this was sometime in the end of April 1978. You don't have to travel all the way to Delhi. I'm going to Madras in April, in May, and I'll be in Madras for about 15 days. So if it is possible, come to Madras in the second week of May. So in the second week of May, I went there, stayed with her for a week. She corrected my thesis, a MPhil thesis. And as I was leaving, she said, don't bother to come to Delhi to submit the thesis. You send it by post. I'll get the chairman's signature. And those of you who have submitted thesis in JNU know the rigmarole that you have to go through, the number of photographs that you have to get from different sections. She did it all by herself and submitted the thesis. But something had happened around that time, about which I had no knowledge, which I came to know later from an office attendant in the department. Perhaps you would remember Radheshyam. It was Radheshyam who told me about this. What had taken her to Madras in early May was the meeting of the Epigraphical Society of India. To this meeting, she had invited the Soviet, those days it was Soviet Union, the Soviet Indologist Nikita Guru, who was part of the team which was working on the Harappan script, along with Yuri Morozov and Shoposhnikova. Guru was one of the leading members of that team. She had suggested the Epigraphical Society of India was meeting in Madras, and he could give a special lecture there. So she had taken Guru to Madras, and in the Epigraphical Society, she suggested this. Epigraphical Society, those days, even now, was under the control of some of the most obscurantist kind of scholars, and they weren't very happy with the idea of inviting Guru to give a special lecture, particularly because some of them knew the kind of interpretation that he had about Harappan script. So they said he can present a paper if he is interested. He cannot have a special lecture from him. She felt very slighted and she protested. And she said, no, I want to move a resolution. Fine, simply given. Then privately the secretary, I don't want to name, privately the secretary went and told Professor Champakalakshmi a few hours later, the EC is scheduled for 9:30, but I understand that it is a very inconvenient time. Can we have it tomorrow morning? She said, fine, that is very good, because she was living in Saidapet and this was happening in Egmore. So she said, okay, we'll have the executive committee tomorrow. The next day when she went there, she was told that the executive committee had already met because there was no written communication about the postponement. So she was cheated. The reason was very simply this. They didn't want to face this censure motion in the executive committee. She was very angry, and perhaps you know her character when she is really angry. She wanted to resign from the body. But she knew that if she sent a resignation letter, that will remain in the files there as another piece of paper in the files of the Epigraphical Society. So she decided to make so many copies of this resignation letter, as there are primary members, got the addresses of them, wrote out the addresses of these members, put them on the envelope. When the packet of my dissertation reached her. So this is what Radheshyam told me. When the packet of dissertation reached her, she kept aside these things because this was more important for her. She opened it, took the file, and saw that the examiner had been already appointed, and the examiner was the secretary of this society who had slighted her. about whom she had written this nasty letter of resignation. She thought, she didn't have to think a lot. She didn't want to put the interests of a student in jeopardy. So what she did was tore all these envelopes with the letters one by one, consigned them to the dustbin along with her own self-esteem. Yes, that is what she was. I'm sorry. Rest in peace, my mother. I'm sorry. That is what she was.
I think at this point and note, we conclude the session, and I request Professor Dineshan to say the word of thanks.
On behalf of all everybody gathered here in KCHR, I extend profound gratitude to eminent Professor Romila Thapa, Professor Rajan Kurikal, Professor Keshwan Balatat, Professor K.N. Ganesh, and all those who are participating online and offline for commemorating eminent Professor Champakalakshmi. Your presence here stands as testimony to her great impact on the personal life as well as on academic community. Our sincere appreciation for honoring Professor Champakalakshmi's memory with your insightful reflections and meaningful presence. Thank you very much.
So we conclude the session.